2 years after Boris Becker lost in the first round of the Wimbledon boys tournament as a 15-year-old, he won the senior Wimbledon men's title. This is the tale of how Becker rose to the pinnacle of the game and the story of how the player who he lost to at junior Wimbledon, Stefan Edberg, became his greatest rival and his best friend. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup, and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about some of the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred, and welcome to the show. In the 1983 boys singles event at Wimbledon, a Swedish 17-year-old called Stefan Edberg was drawn against an unheard-of young German with a cascade of ginger blonde hair in the first round. The German's name was Boris Becker. He was 15. Edberg took the first set 6-2. In the second set, Becker, 2 years Edberg's junior, managed to wrest 2 more games from the Swede than he managed in the first, although he still lost the set 6-4. After losing, he went home to Germany, while Edberg went into the next round and the round after that. Edberg progressed undefeated through so many rounds that eventually he won the boys' title. The tennis inner sanctum was watching. They began to murmur appreciatively. Edberg was one to keep an eye on, they said, with a nod and a wink. The dynasty of Swedish men's champions was clearly going through another impressive iteration. Bjorn Borg had come and gone, turning the temper tantrums inward to become the coolest customer in tennis. Mats Wilander was doing his dogged baseline thing. The next 10 years were going to be very interesting indeed. A year later, and Becker, now 16, turned professional, and a year after that, in 1985, he demonstrated that he had outgrown the boys' tournament by winning the men's. He was 17, and he beat a South African, Kevin Curran, in 4 sets in the final, Curran having beaten Edberg in 3 tight sets in the 4th round. Should I mistakenly have heard you whisper that Curran's arrival in the final was a fluke, let me take this opportunity to politely point out that Curran beat Jimmy Connors and John McEnroe along the way. Becker's transformation from first-round loser in the boys' tournament in 1983 to winner of the senior title 2 years later must surely rank as one of the most remarkable journeys ever undertaken by a young sportsman. So much must have been stuffed into this autobahn of becoming, this flowering of tennis self, that it defies description, but let's try, if only in the knowledge that we are likely to fail. First, Becker must have become appreciably stronger. Second, he must have learned so much about his game and become so much better at what he had learnt. Third, he must somehow have gained almost supersonic levels of tennis confidence, the levels of confidence that other talented young tennis players can only have dreamt of. How this was achieved is best explained by neuroscience, although equally it might also be explained by biomechanics and educational psychology. Maybe, though, we need not look too deeply. Maybe Mrs. Becker was simply adding an extra dumpling or two to young Boris's Eisbein and sauerkraut, while Mr. Becker was giving him a pat on the back and asking if he had enough money for train fare. To the above list, we might add a cheeky 4th point, a rhetorical lob, if you like. The lob consists of just this. Becker's meteoric rise might also have had a little something to do with the fact that his parents were sane and, although this sounds frightfully stuffy and fuddy-duddyish, rather sensible. Sensible parents are by no means a given in the high-stakes world of international sport. Take Becker's compatriot, Steffi Graf, and her notorious father, Peter, who was, to borrow some sports-appropriate terminology, an ace nutter. Graf won the French Open as a 17-year-old, beating Martina Navratilova in the final, so was as talented and precocious as Becker at exactly the same age. She, however, had her father, a former tennis coach, to manage upwards. and this she did with a kind of slightly distant, embarrassed love for much of her career. Peter Graf was monomaniacal. He had his young daughter practice many hours a day. As a teenager, he allowed her no social life, no life really of any description. Many years later, he served 25 months out of a possible 45 months in prison for tax evasion. The best description of his madness comes from Steffi's husband, Andre Agassi, in his book Open, in which he describes her dad and his dad, an equally touched fellow, getting together for the first time. Quote, Pete is trash-talking in German, my father is trash-talking in Assyrian, and they're both putting up their fists. They're circling, feinting, bobbing and weaving, and just before one of them throws hands, I step in and push them apart. Fortunately, Boris's dad was not a tennis coach with a strong desire to practice a kind of lifelong experiment on his son. He was an architect, a profession in which everything needs to be kept inside the tramlines, and there is nothing in the record to suggest that Boris's dad wasn't adept at keeping the boundaries. Contrary to Steffi's dad, who treated his family as if they lived in a laboratory, the Beckers were notably normal, and they were not a family without intellectual pretension. Their son, for example, was rather taken with a quizzical, rather meandering delivery in press conferences. Perhaps all he really wanted to demonstrate was that behind that fearsome serve and volley game, he was a top thinker as well as a top spinner. Looked at through a different prism, let's follow a list of the other tennis players featured in the boys' event at Wimbledon in 1983, just to see how incredible was Becker's capture of the senior title 2 years later. Some names might be vaguely familiar: Aaron Krickstein, Karl Novacek, or even Patrick McEnroe, younger brother of the more famous John, but some have sunk beneath the low water mark of memory. Take Carlos Chabalgoiti, the young Brazilian. There's a name I bet you've forgotten. Or Mushaf Zia from Pakistan, or Norbert Teufelberger from Austria, who reached the quarterfinals in the 1983 boys' event but didn't progress much beyond that. These are not, you'll agree, household names. They have not, you'll agree, stood the test of time. All of these young tennis players were talented. They possessed that most protean of commodities, promise, and for most of them that promise would remain unfulfilled, as it does for hundreds of promising tennis players worldwide. Becker's promise, meanwhile, blossomed to a quite outrageous degree. There was nothing easy about his Wimbledon run in the men's draw in 1985 either. He lost a set to Hank Pfister in winning in the first round and cantered to a straightforward 3-sets victory in the second. Come the third and fourth rounds, however, it was backs to the wall. First, Becker met Joachim Nystrom, a positive old-timer at 22, beating him in a mammoth 5 sets in the third round. In the fourth round, Becker faced the American Tim Mayotte, who was a month short of his 25th birthday and so a comparative old-age pensioner and a crazy 8 years Becker's senior. Against Mayotte, Becker won the first set and lost the second. He lost the third on the tiebreak, won the fourth on the tiebreak, and won the fifth 6-2. He was now in the quarterfinals, a long way indeed from losing to Edberg in the first round of the boys' tournament 2 years previously. Some might have thought he was done, content to leave it there, but leaving things be, leaving things on the table, leaving things untouched, was not Becker's way. He beat Henri Leconte in 4 sets, setting up a semi-final with Anders Järryd, the Swedish 5th seed. Järryd broke Becker's serve twice in the first set, taking matters 6-2. It appeared to galvanize the young Becker, and although the second set crept on a knife edge to the tiebreak, Becker prevailed. He took the third and fourth sets with room to breathe. He was in the final against Curran, the Connors slayer, and we all know what happened there. Forgive me while I interrupt a sports story to tell you about the Luke Alfred Show Patreon. As you may know, Being a writer is not the most lucrative career choice. Please consider making a small donation to keep the show going at patreon.com/The Luke Alfred Show. But for now, let's get back to the story. As if to demonstrate that he was no fancy Dan flash in the pan, Becker captured the Wimbledon men's title the following year as well, beating Ivan Lendl in 3 sets. In 1987, the year after that, it was a lean one for Becker. He lost to Australia's Peter Doohan in the second round. Doohan's compatriot, Pat Cash, surely some nominative determinism here, beating Lendl in the last of Lendl's Wimbledon finals. In 1988, with Becker not yet 21, he was drawn in the Wimbledon final against none other than Edberg, who had beaten him in 2 sets way back in the first round of the boys' competition in 1983. The 1980s had been a good decade for champions. The Cash story was a good one. He was only 22 when he won Wimbledon, but not such a hot decade for stories. The crowning of a champion is an occasion for rejoicing. Watching the development of a story, however, particularly if that story contains 2 potential champions, provides an extra dimension. It is the difference between, say, a down-the-line passing shot and a cross-court passing shot. The one is pleasing, aesthetically neat. The other is a marvel to behold. When, in 1988, Edberg got into the first of his and Becker's 3 consecutive Wimbledon finals, Edberg had never reached a Wimbledon men's final before at 5 attempts. He had won the Australian Open in 1985, the first of his 7 major victories, but Wimbledon, that was something altogether different. It does show, in passing, that prediction can be a hazardous thing. Wasn't Edberg the young Swede who had wonderful things predicted for him when he won the boys' Wimbledon title in 1983? That he took a while to get there makes Becker's supersonic ascent to the pinnacle of the game all the more remarkable. The first set in the 1988 Wimbledon men's final was won by Becker, the second by Edberg, 7-2 in the tiebreak. At some point the rain came down so heavily that play was suspended, the players returning on the Monday. With Becker becoming increasingly frustrated with himself, Edberg broke the powerful Becker serve, the cornerstone of his game, once in the 3rd set and twice in the 4th, to take the final in 4 sets. It was a momentous day for Edberg, who had said beforehand that playing Becker on Wimbledon's centre court was rather like stepping into the Becker living room, so familiar was Boris on it. He wasn't quite as young as Becker had been when he won Wimbledon back in 1985, but he was no octogenarian. He was, in point of fact, a young whippersnapper at 22. The Edberg victory in the 1988 final started the story. Afterwards, the story started to curl in on itself, providing depth, colour, psychological shading. After his consecutive Wimbledon victories in 85 and 86, had Becker shot his bolt? Edberg might have compared centre court to Becker's living room, but was Becker now, proverbially speaking, lounging on the sofa, trawling unhappily through the channels with his grubby remote, while he tossed popcorn into his mouth like a brat? Maybe Becker, with his ginger blonde hair and absurdly short shorts, was a shooting star. He had lit up the tennis firmament spectacularly, but now he was fading from view, and quickly. Defending a title, perhaps because of the baggage it brings, seems to be more difficult than going hell for leather for victory, if victory is something you don't yet have. There certainly seemed to be something out of sorts, existential even, in Edberg's defense of his title come the 1989 final, as the quote we are about to hear from him demonstrates.
I got off to a terrible start. It was just uphill right from the beginning.
By contrast, it wasn't uphill for the man everyone was now calling Boom Boom at all. He was sailing. He was sailing so smoothly he might even have been sailing downhill. Armed with his big serve and playing a dynamic, aggressive game shorn of doubt, Becker had beaten Lendl in a 5-set semi-final that lasted slightly over 4 hours, and, although the semi was tiring, he felt on top form. A dynamo of all-out action, he took the first set against Edberg 6-love. Sensing that he was required to draw a line in the sand, not to mention man the ramparts, Edberg dug deep in set 2, which went to the tiebreak. Even so, Becker prevailed, taking the set at 7-6, playing tennis, according to Wilander, quote, like a freight train. At 2 sets down, Edberg still had a nominal chance to defend his title. As the third set progressed, that chance was whittled down so much by the Becker power game that eventually it wasn't there. Becker won the set 6-4, capturing the title he hadn't held since beating Lendl in the 1986 final. As we are about to hear, he felt that his form in the second of these 3 finals against Edberg demonstrated him at his absolute best. And, here's the thing, he managed to do it all despite wearing a white pullover with purple braiding.
That was my best Wimbledon altogether, where I felt really, really strong.
Very similar questions to the ones that had followed Becker after his fallow period now attached themselves to Edberg like overzealous ball boys. He could cut the mustard down in Australia, but here, where everyone was watching in the same time zone, he was faltering. He only won 1 Wimbledon title, and that he'd done. Edberg wasn't yet 25, and he was a spent force. At least that's what some folk were saying. Despite standing on opposite sides of the net, Becker and Edberg liked one another. Being the more voluble, the more talkative, this was more pronounced in Becker's case, but Edberg himself was reciprocally fond of the German in his likeably droll Swedish way. Yes, the German might have talked too much, and he did have that strange start to his serve in which, with his legs close together, it looked as though he might just fall over, but you weren't the one who actually had to face the serve when it arrived. Things were okay between them. They were better than okay, in fact. Edberg and Becker actually liked one another. The second of the Wimbledon finals in the Becker-Edberg trilogy of finals provides us with a great tennis anecdote. History tells us that the 1989 final was watched by a boy growing up in Switzerland called Roger Federer. I say watched, but Federer has subsequently admitted that he struggled to watch that final. He struggled to watch because he liked both players almost as much as they liked each other. Yes, he inclined at first to Becker, appreciating his muscular, centre-forward type appeal. So conflicted was Federer, however, that he watched from the floor rather than the sofa, and as he watched, he sort of began rooting for Edberg. Such identification was complete when his friends found fault with his support of Boom Boom. Edberg is cooler, far cooler, they said, so Federer opted for the Swede. It was a good thing he did because Edberg, not wanting to repeat his uphill climb of the previous year's final, decided that the best way to approach things was to step on the gas. He sprinted into a 2-set lead. He lost his serve early in the third set, however, and Becker immediately seized the initiative, as Edberg puts it in his inimitably dry way.
Then I think I dropped my serve at the beginning of the third set, and oops, trouble. Boris sees his chance and starts picking up his game.
Becker won sets 3 and 4, so it all boiled down to the fifth, making life exceedingly difficult for young Federer watching on the carpet back home in Switzerland. He would be obliged to choose. Becker and Edberg were obliged to choose too. Everybody was. In the fifth set, Becker broke Edberg's serve and surged to a 3-1 lead. What happened next was very un-Becker-like. He said since that with victory in sight, he actually started to imagine what it would be like when it was over. This fateful lapse in concentration cost him. Sportsmen and women are best when they remain in the moment. Being in the moment means not being in any other moment. For to be in another moment fragments their consciousness and concentration. Other moments take different forms. There can be moments before the moment you are in. These are regretful moments. Or they can be moments in advance of where you are. These are next thing moments, celebratory moments, ego and vanity moments. They are very possibly the more dangerous moments to those who want to remain in the moment. So here, Boom Boom was boomeranging out of the moment, projecting himself into another moment, and in so doing, losing the Wimbledon men's final of 1990. So how exactly did the losing moment unfold? Well, having dashed to the net behind his serve, Becker put a regulation volley straight into it. Now the scores were level at 4-all. Sensing his opportunity like a politician honing in on a tastily divisive issue, Edberg steeled his nerves. He broke Becker's serve and held his own to win the fifth set 6-4, and with it the last of his men's Wimbledon finals. Edberg has lived a dignified and relatively ordinary post-tennis life, while his old friend Becker has indulged in one, quote, George Best moment after another. I'm sure you can guess what the George Best moment is, but just in case you're confused, the George Best moment is the point at which things begin to go appreciably wrong. It's a silly notion, because things don't go wrong in sequence, they go wrong altogether. Or there is no first going wrong, just an accumulation of insignificant things which add up to something more difficult to manage. To be sure, things have gone wrong for Becker. He spent 8 months in prison for tax evasion, for example, telling the tabloid newspapers that he had to buy himself protection to stay alive. He's been married 3 times and once had a well-publicized sexual encounter with a Russian waitress at a swanky London restaurant that resulted in a love child. The other reason why the George Best moment notion is so patently wrong is that Becker himself is unlikely to subscribe to it. Becker is a celebrity who lives in a rarefied world. Deep down, I don't think he believes what applies to us applies to him. If this is the case, it's probably his greatest Wimbledon victory to think that most of us still like him. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly why. Perhaps it's because there's something essentially wholesome in Becker, something winningly human that all of us can relate to. I might have lingered on the addiction to painkillers and sleeping pills, the booze, the extramarital affairs, but these are mere footfalls in the great journey of life, are they not? I prefer to think about Becker's strength, those line-backer thighs, the Becker backhand, so accurate, so deadly, the fact that he trampled and snorted through the sport like a little bull in the Wimbledon china shop. And I prefer to think that as a 15-year-old, he flew to Wimbledon to play in the boys' tournament, where he met a future friend. That friend became an enemy, and then a friend again, and Becker played against him in 3 consecutive Wimbledon men's finals. In 1983, however, all the young Becker could do against a 17-year-old Edberg was to fly home and, up in the air, admit to himself that the Swede was bigger and better than he was. Not that that moment lasted for very long. If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please give me a 5-star rating. As an independent creator, this podcast is made possible through your support.